Thank you, Catherine, for that reading. I think it's difficult for us to accurately imagine the person who has the kind of passion Isaiah is describing in this servant song of his. So few people today appear to have the courage of their convictions. And when those sorts of people do show up on the radar, they're often lauded as great heroes. Figures like Gandhi or Mother Teresa or Nelson Mandela, even our very own Reverend Dr. Sir Alan Walker, who started Lifeline and within the Uniting Church. They offered extraordinary servant leadership in their particular circumstances. And yet at the same time, the virtues exemplified by these heroes have kind of been relegated as somehow anachronistic in our day, because our dominant culture seems to want to have others serve us. You don't want to serve anybody else if you can possibly avoid it. But Isaiah envisages a servant who has extraordinary power, the power to bring others alive. And I just want to give a bit of an explanatory disclaimer at this point. I'm going to be referring to the servant as he. Now, I do that because Isaiah refers to the servant as he, and I'm aware that there's all sorts of challenges around pronouns these days, and servants don't have to be he, okay? But the important part is not the pronoun, it's the serving, and that's what I want to focus on. One of the most powerful things we can do as human beings, I think, is to encourage and sustain one another. And it's not as easy to do as we first might think. It's not merely the mouthing of particular positive platitudes, and while pleasant platitudes may be preferable to constant caustic criticism, I was doing a bit of alliteration there, platitudes are not sustaining words. They are just empty filler, something to offer when you have nothing really to offer. The meaning interchange that Isaiah understands God's servant to be engaged in is far more than merely just filling in the silence or putting words on a blank screen. God's servant conveys meaning to the people in a way that functions for the spirit and the soul like nourishing food does for the body. God's servant speaks from an awareness of fundamental truth, and God's servant speaks to the unvarnished reality of the people. God's servant is known for well-chosen words, offered precisely for their power to sustain the people with whom they are shared. And the reason these words are sustaining to the weary is because they come out of a process of intent listening. You're probably not aware of this unless you're on the music team, but each week Ian Avery reflects back to the music team how the group have led in the service and helped the congregation to enter into worship. Ian is not just saying any old thing when he reflects back to the group. He listens and he notices stuff. He draws into the foreground that which might otherwise be overlooked, and he offers sustenance to the group with those words. Just like this servant who, in a very deliberate and focused manner, takes time before the distractions of the day come crowding in to listen. And I have to say, our world has never had a more urgent need of servants who listen in this way. It's never been as hard to carve out a time and a space required to do this kind of listening. We have so many ready-made, portable and always-on distraction devices. We are bombarded with a veritable deluge of constant information, such that we can no longer discern facts from outright fanciful stories that serve no purpose at all apart from the exercise of distraction. And yet truth stands true even when there is no person to believe it, whereas lies and distraction only survive to the extent that people support and pay attention to them. And this servant draws aside from the bustle of the popular froth to discern the abiding truth of God and then to speak from that truth. And this is a surprisingly confronting posture for the servant to adopt. Confronting to those around the servant, because nothing is more confronting for those who dwell in half-truths to have to face up to the larger realities. But this divine truth is even more confronting to the servant himself. For the servant to be able to be an effective channel of this divine truth, he must first allow it to enter and confront him personally. This is, as they say, the real moment of truth. And most of us, most of the time, when faced with truth that would challenge our already established sense of who we are and our place in the world, we tend to turn back at that point. If the servant wants to genuinely serve others with the truth of God, the most effective way is to allow that truth to first address him as fully as possible. And part of what happens when the servant allows God's truth to appropriately address him is that the servant is changed by this ongoing encounter. The servant begins to discern the presence and voice of God in the most unlikely of places. The servant becomes open in a genuinely vulnerable way to the voice of God in those quiet moments carved out of the distracting day. But by doing that, the servant also learns to be open to the voice of God in the confronting conflicts of the social currents that swirl around during the day. Rather than protecting himself or putting on the defensive social armour, the servant puts on the armour of God. Rather than the defensive stratagems of the world like distract or blame or hide or flee, the servant adopts instead for the full armour of God, things like truth, righteous relationships, faith, a sense of security in God's salvation. And the deep challenge of the servant's posture is that it remains non-retaliatory, which is to say the servant somehow manages to resist the natural urge to give as good as he gets. The servant's response is no mere reaction. There is a decided freedom from the usual cause and effect of normal human social dynamics. The servant short-circuits the auto-reciprocal chain of escalating reactions, and instead there's a listening to an outside voice, a voice beyond the crowd, beyond the social media posts, beyond the indentured commentariat, a voice not constrained by survival interests of its own, but fully motivated by a wise and genuine love for others. It's no wonder the servant must take time each morning to recalibrate and be recalibrated by this other voice, as it is a persistently alternative to all the other voices around. And this other voice, this divine voice of God, is by no means easy to hear. And that's not because God is unwilling to speak with us, but because we are hard of hearing. And the more especially, we prefer not to hear that which will challenge us. Truth is often painful to confront. And the truth here is responding to the call of God always involves a certain amount of pain for the servant. And the pain is twofold. First, there is the pain for the servant of allowing the divine truth to challenge the servant personally. Then, as the servant is transformed by this divine truth in all that he says and does, there is the pain of the inevitable pushback directed at the servant by the people to whom the servant is sent to serve, as they react to God's truth. The effective servant must be open and non-reactive to both of these expressions of suffering. In fact, rather than assuming the natural posture of kind of curling into that metaphoric fetal ball to protect against any direct threat, the servant is to stand tall and face what is coming, both within himself and around himself. The effective servant learns much by both his own internal struggle with the truth of God and the way that people push back against that truth and against the servant. Both of these challenging dynamics offer still deeper and fuller insight into and an appreciation of the servant's task and what God has set God's heart on achieving through the servant. This servant of God offers himself even to those who attack him. If people come to strike at the servant, he presents his back to them for the striking. If they come to pull out his whiskers out of the servant's beard, which is an act of repudiation and contempt, he does not hide from them. The servant looks his accusers in the eye, even as they spit in his face, and he is available to the people. The servant is so held by the truth of God, the people identify him with, and he so identifies himself with that same truth, that he's not going to back away or hide. And this servant of God is enabled to stand in the face of what seems universal rejection because God stands with him. If you can only see the gathered crowd, if you're entirely tuned in to the social media or the popular commentary, it would appear the servant is without hope. In fact, the servant's hope is more sound, stable, and secure than the fickle and self-absorbed whim of the crowd. The crowd will turn on a dime the moment they think their best interest lies in a different direction. Those who cried, "Hosanna," and "Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord," were the very same people who cried, "Crucify him," less than a week later. The servant knows this about human social dynamics, and he is not dismayed by it. That fickle reality is already factored into his posture. It is true that with a number of prophets, we're allowed to see the struggle of the internal process. And indeed, with Jesus in the garden, as he awaits his betrayer, he wrestles with the full awfulness of what he knows will soon transpire. And he even says to the Father, "If there be any other way." But he never says, "I can't do this." He never says, "I won't do this." To not fulfill God's call is not among the options under consideration. It is as though that decision has already been taken. It is now simply a matter of living into it and living into all that God's call means. The servant knows full well that he is a servant, not indentured to this family or to that household, but a servant of God, indentured to the truth and to the service of the best interests of all the people in all eternity. And that's a really big call. The world cannot possibly understand this. Short-term, self-interested approaches to life will always jar with this servant's way. Not only will they jar, the short-term oriented and self-interested will inevitably feel exposed by the servant's very presence. And in reaction to this discomfort, people tend to push back. They find ways to blame the one who they see as the cause of their discomfort. One thing about wanting to be comfortable, of course, is that we also want to be comfortable with a particular comfort that we find comfortable. And there's a deep disjuncture in our culture in the way, and it's kind of developed exponentially in recent years, that makes it very apparent that when our comforts are built on the sufferings of others, they're not so comfortable for us. We've seen this in all manner of campaigns, like exposing sweatshops with poor people working in appalling conditions for low wages to make luxury products for the wealthy. Or the spotlighting of blatant exploitation or oppression of disadvantaged and minority groups to secure so-called democratic political advantage. Hidden in our liberal democratic culture, as in all world cultures, is the tacit proviso that there are always some who will dominate and others who will be dominated. And against this cultural norm stands the servant, who is neither dominating nor dominated. The servant serves the God of love and truth. The servant acts love and lives the truth. He will be opposed for doing so. He will be painted as a threat. He will be accused and blamed, and he will be rejected. But he will not step back or bow down. The servant will meet his accusers with the truth and love of God in everything he says and does. And this will ultimately save him, not from the horrors his enemies might inflict on him, but from the ultimate sting of those horrors. The goodness and the purity of the servant's heart mean the horror is seen for what it is, not a judgment on the one who is rejected, but a reflection of the horror that comes out of those who perpetrate it. Those who act so poorly against him will soon be forgotten forever. But the servant's life lives on. He abides as the exemplar par excellence of truth and love, and thereby continues to nourish the life of the community. The servant of God has a singular passion. That passion is to serve God with everything he is, everything he has, everything he says, and everything he does. This servant is utterly sold out for his cause. Isaiah prefigured the one who in the fullness of time would be present among the people. Just as predicted, the people would abuse and reject him. The people would cast him out utterly, but that would not be the final word. The servant would live on beyond the people's rejection, and still today, some people come to realize that he is God in our midst. Hosanna, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Let us allow him to welcome us to his table this morning. Hosanna in the highest. Let us pray. Lord, for your humble, loving, gracious, honest service to us, for the power of truth in love that you bring into our very heart and into our midst as a community, for the way you transform the meaning of things so that we can see what is good and what is not. We give you thanks. We thank you for calling us into your body, to live that life that you lived, and to share that love that you shared, and to transform the world as you have transformed it. To the glory of your name. Amen.